Welcome back to the next episode in a series where we see how easy it is to get up and running with various Linux distributions, from downloading from their webpage all the way to running our first game. So far, the distros we've been looking at have been clean slates. They don't have many pre-installed apps. They're meant for us to install what we want to install. But there are other types of Linux distros out there. And of that category, we're looking specifically at Linux distributions that try to do what the Steam Deck does, and also targeting portable hardware as well as desktops. So to kick off our first Swiss Army knife of gaming Linux distribution, today we'll be looking at Bazzite. If you're following along, you'll need a Ventoy USB. If you're not sure what that means, then I'm going to give you the very quick version so we can get into Bazzite as soon as possible. For starters, you'll need a USB drive that's 8 gigabytes or more, and you'll need to back up all the data on that USB because we're about to wipe it. Then you would download Bazzite Etcher, and you would download Ventoy. Once you're in Bazzite Etcher, you would select Ventoy in the first section here, and your USB drive in the second section. This is your last chance to back up all the data on this USB before it's completely wiped. Because once you hit flash, you now have a Ventoy USB. If that was way too fast, don't fret. I've got a video dedicated to getting that process up and running. It's called Try Before You Buy. So you can watch that and then come back here if you'd like. But if not, if you've got a Ventoy USB, or if you just want to see what Bazzite's all about before you install anything, kick back, relax, and let's get started. Finding Bazzite in your search engine should be super simple. Should be the first option, depending on your search engine. The website has no cookies notice. Clicking the download button takes us further down the page. And here we'll get a few drop-down options to find the installer that's right for us. This might be a little bit confusing for some beginners. Some people might not even know what hardware they have in their PCs, especially if they're older generations or those PCs have been donated to them. So even though it might be obvious to some people, as this series is targeted for beginners as well, I'm going to go through these options with you. Firstly, I'll be installing this to a desktop PC. If you think another option in this menu suits what you're installing this to, then feel free to pick that option. But if you want to follow this tutorial note for note, then you want desktop PC. Next, some details about your GPU. Now, if you are in the camp of people who haven't got a clue what you've got inside your system, here's a tip. If you're on Windows, press Ctrl-Alt-Delete. Then select Task Manager. Underneath File Options and View, you should see a Performance tab next to the Processes tab. Here, you'll find a bunch of details about the hardware in your system. Find the GPU section, and you should be able to find out what sort of GPU you have inside your computer. Next is the desktop environment. So far, we've looked at KDE inside of Manjaro, Cinnamon inside of Mint, and we did get a brief look at GNOME inside of Ubuntu. However, Ubuntu had a few other problems, so I didn't really get to deep dive into GNOME that much. So that's the one I'm going to pick for here. But if you'd like to pick a different desktop environment, feel free. The choice is yours. And finally, this distro comes with an option to boot directly into Steam. This is designed to simulate the Steam Deck experience as close as possible. But just like the desktop environment, I'm going to leave this choice to you. I am going to pick No here. Now we get a relatively customized ISO file to download. Click on download and that should go to your downloads folder or another location if you've set it. I've set mine to go to the desktop just for this video. Once it's downloaded, plug in your Ventoy USB and drag and drop or copy and paste Bazzite onto your Ventoy USB. And then safely eject. You might notice that I already have Bazzite on this USB. That's because as I was looking through the documentation for Bazzite, I noticed that they said they don't support Ventoy. I can confirm that Bazzite does work with Ventoy. However, if it's not working for you, then I'd suggest going back to Bazzite Etcher and flashing Bazzite directly onto the USB, because that's what the devs have recommended. Now, for the computer that you want to install Bazzite on. Regardless of whether you are wiping whatever operating system you had there before, whether you're splitting an SSD in two, known as partitioning, or whether you are installing to a completely different SSD inside the same system, back up your data, because things can go wrong in any install process in any distro, whether it be Windows or Linux. I'll likely warn you to back up your data a few more times. So with your data backed up, shut down the computer that you want to install Bazzite on. Now find the Delete or F2 keys on your keyboard. Once you've found them, press the On button and rapidly tap either the Delete or F2 keys while the computer's booting up. This should get you into the BIOS, which looks something like this. If it doesn't work, shut down the computer and try again. Perhaps trying the alternative key. So if you tried Delete, try F2, and if you tried F2, try Delete. It's different depending on what your motherboard manufacturer has set it up as. So once you're in the BIOS, if it doesn't have mouse support, you might need to navigate the menus with the arrow keys instead of your mouse. Next up, we want to find the boot override option. This motherboard has boot override, and it's in the save and exit section of this menu. But if you have a motherboard by a different manufacturer, such as Asus, MSI, or ASRock, it might be in a different section. So once you find a boot override section, I'm just going to find my USB and press enter. That's going to boot me into Ventoy. And then once I'm in Ventoy, I will use the arrow keys to hover over Bazzite and press enter again. Here you can press enter on normal mode. And then the first page of Bazzite's installer gives us the option to test this media. I don't need to test this media. If you would like to test your media, feel free to. But if you'd like to skip it, you can press up on the arrow key and press enter. So all you need to do is wait a few moments, and then we should boot into the Bazzite installer. Language is easy enough, and then we get into what is kind of like a main menu of an installer. A lot of default settings have been set for us, but one setting that we have to manually select is where we want to install Bazzite to. So we'll click on installation destination. Clicking on that reveals all drives in this PC, whether they be USB, SSD, or hard drive. Make sure you select the right one because everything will be wiped. This is another warning to make sure you've backed up everything before proceeding. Once you've selected the right drive that you want to install Bazzite on, select Done in the top left-hand corner. If it's not an empty drive, Bazzite will likely tell you that it needs more space on this drive. That's because Bazzite's looking for an empty partition on the drive, and if you have anything else installed, it's likely taken up the entire drive. Whether you're wiping a particular partition or you want to wipe the drive, you will need to click Reclaim Space here. And if you want to wipe the entire drive and start from fresh, then over in the bottom right of this new window that's appeared is a Delete All button. Select that, and hopefully you understand that that is going to delete everything off of this drive. So you've backed up your data. This will give Bazzite the entire drive. Once that's done, you could technically start the install process, but Bazzite has already auto-filled a username and a password for you. And if you just continue the install process, you might not even know what the password is. So I'd recommend going and setting your own username and password so you know what to log in as. That's over in this next section. Now, this is normally the part where I would roast Windows about not having a local account option. And that's all well and good. But the option to automatically log in is another thing I also roast Windows for. And that option isn't here. But don't worry, it is in the operating system. So you just have to wait until it's installed before you go and set that option, and we will go and do that. And now for the proper install process. It took me 14 minutes and 6 seconds, less than half the time of my last Windows install a few years ago. And something tells me they haven't cut down the install time since I last did it. I also decided to check my home network to see if Bazzite needed anything from the internet to install, but it appears that it didn't need to. I will test this in the future along with all the other distros we've looked at, and I will test it by unplugging the internet entirely so that it can't sneak in a few packets, and we'll see which ones pass and fail. Now, while we're waiting for Bazzite to install, don't worry, I've actually sped up the footage. You're not sitting here for 14 minutes and 6 seconds. I haven't told you what Bazzite is based off of. Previously, we've talked about how Manjaro was based off of Arch, and how Mint and Ubuntu were based off of Debian. These are the two most popular foundations of Linux, to oversimplify things. But there is another. Bazzite is built off of Fedora, which is another foundation and also another distribution on its own. But we'll look at that distribution in another video. Another thing I'll mention related to the install process. It might appear that you're stuck on this particular message. However, according to some brief research on the internet, it appears that this is perfectly normal. So you only need to be a little bit patient and it will shoot on through. So don't worry if you feel like you're stuck here. And then once it's done, it's time for the reboot. You'll see a bunch of different screens flash up here. I only needed to press enter on this particular screen, but besides that, the next screen I saw was the login screen, which, come to think of it, we haven't actually seen a login screen on this channel yet because normally we do auto login. But as I mentioned, we'll get to that option later on. Doesn't have to be the installer in order to pass, we just need the option. Microsoft. As I mentioned in my first video, A Beginner's Guide to Linux, KDE had more of a Windows feel to it, but GNOME had more of a Mac OS feel. So you might be taken aback by the layout of this at first, especially if you're used to Windows. But all you're seeing here is multiple workspaces. In order to visualize this, think of this as a multiple monitor setup, except completely digital, not requiring a second monitor. But if you're not a fan of multiple workspaces and you want to simplify this, then I'll show you how to kill the other workspaces in a moment. Once we're in, we get one whole pop-up. This particular type of pop-up, a donation pop-up, is pretty standard because most Linux distributions are community efforts. They have people working behind them, but they're not paid by a big corporation necessarily, yet they can produce a better product. Odd. So a lot of them do depend on community donations. However, they're not going to incessantly bug you all the time. And to test this, not only did I get rid of this pop-up, but I restarted multiple times off camera just to see if the pop-up would come back. Because like Windows, pop-ups keep coming back every time you restart your computer. And every time you restart, it feels like there's more pop-ups. Use Microsoft's recommended browser settings, but Bazzite doesn't do that. Now onto display settings. As with most Linux distributions, all we need to do is right-click on the desktop and we get display settings right there and then. I do wonder if anyone else has noticed this yet, but some Linux distributions only have the option for 100% for scaling or 200%. 100% is great for 1080p, 200 is great for 4K, but it does leave some other people, such as 1440p monitor people, out on the wayside a little bit. There are other ways to enable 125, 150, and 175 scaling in other distros, but I do really like having it out of the box because I do have a few 1440p monitors. Something I think that everyone has probably already noticed at this point is that we're already in dark mode, and that's normally my next stop. However, for those of you who like light mode, all you have to do is go over to Appearance and there's light mode. Now let's tackle those workspaces. Under multitasking, all we have to do is click fixed number of workspaces and set them to 1. Now when we move the mouse to the bottom of our screen, the workspace will still pop out and we'll still get the dock there, but there won't be any other workspaces to accidentally click on. And finally, for the settings menu, as I promised, the auto login feature that Windows can't do out of the box. So in Bazzite, all you have to do is scroll to the bottom of the settings menu, click on System, and then Users. Then click the unlock button, type in your password, and then click the toggle for auto login. It's that simple. No need for a regedit. If only Microsoft knew how to make things simple instead of making it worse for everyone. Now for one of the coolest things about Bazzite when it comes to out of the box. We have Steam pre-installed. That's not to say it was hard to do on Mint or Manjaro, because Steam was in our software center in both of those distros, but having it pre-installed is really neat, especially if this is a gaming focused system. And it's already in the dock. Move your mouse to the bottom of the screen and the dock will appear and we have Steam there. But while we're there and before we click on Steam, you'll notice 2 spaces over is another icon. That's the Bazaar. This is the software center specifically for Bazzite. So if you've watched my other videos, you know that I prefer to do updates before anything else. It would seem that there's nothing to update here because that's what I'm looking for, some sort of update page or something like that. So I can't seem to find the same update page as we had in Mint, Manjaro, and Ubuntu. But I'm sure that app updates would still happen through the software center, and it seems that we have a very fresh version of Bazzite downloaded. So where are our updates? So this is one of the big differences between Bazzite and the other distros we've looked at. And some people are going to love this and some people are going to hate it. Bazzite does updates automatically. Now, why might this be a problem? Some people might not understand it. It's not necessarily a problem practically, but let's look at who else tries to do updates automatically and has failed spectacularly at it for, let's say roughly a decade, maybe even longer. Microsoft and Windows. See, Windows updates are kind of like someone knocking on your door. You open the door, you tell them not now, go away, and you close the door. But then Windows kicks down the door and starts rearranging your house, because you don't get a choice when those updates happen. So if you come from that camp of people who just want the freedom to update whenever you want to update because you've been scarred by Windows, I totally get it. I'm kind of in that camp myself. However, I'm not going to deduct any marks away from Bazzite for doing this, because I actually think it's really cool for two reasons. One, so far Bazzite has done everything it can to make the experience better for us, not worse, aka Microsoft. If Bazzite doesn't update, so far they haven't broken my trust in that update benefiting me. In fact, the idea of booting up my computer and it suddenly getting better performance is pretty cool. And I don't think they're going to pull any of that artificially slow down your computer so that you think you need to buy a new computer even though your current computer is perfectly fine. But two, Bazzite actually looks like it wants to stay out of our way. See this section here where they're actually checking to see that you aren't using a lot of your CPU, GPU, RAM, or specifically playing a game or doing anything important? That's just the download. And as far as I understand it here, they're going to download those updates in the back and then do them when you decide to restart your PC. Not tell you that you need to restart your PC, but the idea of updates happening seamlessly. It's like if this was an alternate timeline, that's what Microsoft would have done for the betterment of the people using Windows. Wow, wouldn't that be a cool timeline? Here's another thing to consider. Imagine that you're the IT person for your entire family, maybe even a group of friends. On Linux, it's actually really easy to teach people who aren't necessarily the most computer savvy people how to update their computer. But having them update automatically is one less thing I have to worry about. But if you absolutely insist on doing the updates yourself, there is an option to do them manually. It's in the documentation. It comes out of the box in the operating system. But by clicking on this button, we get a terminal. And remember, this is a no terminal challenge. We have to be able to use each distro without touching the terminal. So I don't need this. If I had to use Bazzite, I'm accepting that I'm doing auto updates. And if auto updates really bothered me, I'd find another distro. But as I was searching for the update function or anything to do with updates, I noticed something else. And it is by pure coincidence that I had already written into the script for this video how to check your hardware in Task Manager. This is the first time that I have seen a Task Manager-like program, almost identical layout, inside of a Linux distribution out of the box. So let's come back to Steam. It's really as easy as clicking the Steam icon in the dock. As with every single time I've installed Steam freshly on Windows or on Linux, it just takes a moment for the first time to boot up, and then we get the login page. And everything from the login page over to installing your first game is absolutely the same as Windows, so I'm not going to show you that part. Instead, we're going to skip over to the downloads page so I can show you where there is a difference. When you click download on a game, you will see that Proton has appeared. Proton is the translation layer that takes Windows games and makes them work on Linux. Now, another tip. When you click play for the first time on a game, it might not necessarily launch the game straight away. You might think this is a Linux problem, but I remember having this exact problem with multiple games on Windows. All you have to do is click stop and hit play again if you're stuck on downloading content at 0%. Again, I'm not sure if this is a specific thing to some games or if this is a Steam booting for the first time thing, but I do remember it happening a lot on my Windows systems. So today's benchmark is Crash Bandicoot: The Insane Trilogy. It doesn't actually have a benchmark mode, so I'm just going to show you some gameplay to show you it's up and running and ready to go. Normally I'd finish up the video here because we've achieved everything we wanted to as far as downloading, installing, and getting a game running. But there's one other really cool thing I want to show you. When you go over to the top right and click on the power button, you'll notice that under the restart option is a restart to. Remember at the beginning of the video how we had to turn off the computer, turn it back on, press delete or F2 to get into the BIOS, select another option under boot override, and that's how we got into Ventoy to get into Bazzite. If you're a dual booter, someone who boots between Windows and Linux or multiple Linux distributions, you're likely doing that all the time to jump back and forth. But here we have the option to get straight into another distribution from Bazzite, meaning that the computer would restart no need to touch the BIOS. It takes care of everything for you. I don't think Windows would ever put something in like this. But this is something I genuinely wish was in every single Linux distribution. It is so cool. So that's Bazzite. In my opinion, it is a great first impression for beginners new to Linux. It does a lot of heavy lifting for us. With Steam installed out of the box, Mission Center to replace Task Manager, and auto updates so we never have to think about it ever again. So the only caveat here is for those people who really want control of their system, people who want to only update when they decide to update, and also people who want to meticulously pick which programs they have installed on their computer. Little bit of a self-report here. However, even I have to admit, the Bazzite is extremely tempting, even coming from that mindset. So to answer the burning question, can Bazzite replace Windows? Yes. Not only do I think Bazzite could replace Windows for some people, I think it could replace some consoles as well.